Okay, Helen, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me.
You are welcome.
What do you remember about how we came to be in each other's galaxies?
Gosh, how did we? It may have been Sound Social. It may have been a thing in the Hollygar. It might have been an early bongo.
I like the idea that we met dancing.
Yes, we may have met dancing.
I think this is great for the Dancer's Guide to the Galaxy.
What do you think? Do you think it was?
I think we probably met dancing. I think it was one of those early bongos. How do you describe yourself professionally when people ask you that question?
Well, I do describe myself as a philosopher, I guess. Although sometimes I feel wary. It depends a bit about who the other person is, because sometimes if you say you're a philosopher, you get into very deep water really quickly, because people have funny ideas about what it is to be a philosopher, and they think maybe you can help them with their life and stuff, and
Do they ask you about the meaning of life?
Yes, quite often ask you about the meaning of life. Or the other reaction, which is worse really, is that people are frightened. They're sort of, I don't know anything about that.
Do you remember deciding, I'm going to be a philosopher?
Well, it was a bit of an accident really that I ever came to be a philosopher, because I went to study for a degree called PPE, which is Philosophy, Politics and Economics. Because I thought I wanted to do politics and economics and sort of save the world. And philosophy was just this thing that kind of came along as part of the degree. I didn't know what it was. I remember reading a little bit before my interview. I thought, well, I better find out what this subject involves, because they're bound to ask me why I want to do it, and I won't have anything to say. And I found a bit of Descartes in the school library, and it was Discourse on the Method and a bit of the Meditations. And I read that and I did love it. I loved it. I thought, wow, this is amazing stuff. And when I started studying philosophy, I knew immediately that it was my thing. I just thought, this is where they do all that cool stuff that I've been kind of thinking about myself. And suddenly, I realised that there was this universe of thinking that I hadn't known anything about before. I don't suppose I decided then that I was going to be a philosopher, because I didn't really know, what that would take or how you would do it. But I thought, this is my stuff. I can do this.
Yeah, that feeling is really clear. I remember having the same feeling when I was about 11 and going, dancing is my thing. This is my thing. I don't know how to make a living out of it. I have no idea. But yeah, so I really
recognise that feeling.
Recognise it. And it's funny because Descartes was also the first philosophy book I ever read.
Oh, was it really?
Yeah. As a philosopher, what do you do?
Well, so what I suppose I'm trying to do is sort out complicated, knotty questions, try and figure out what the answers to them are. Or sometimes you think at the end of your investigation, well, the question wasn't the right one in the first place. So it's more about figuring out what the questions are than what the answers are. But it feels to me investigative, like it's a bit like, it feels like solving puzzles, it feels like solving crimes, it's like there's this problem and, this is obviously true and this is obviously true, but how can they be true together, because they seem to contradict one another? It's kind of solving problems that have that general shape. How can these things to which I'm totally committed be true together? It's often that. And figuring out, which assumption that you've accepted for the whole of your life is actually deeply flawed, that sort of thing. And it does have, I think it has the excitement of puzzle solving, it's like metaphysical Cluedo or something. Which is the mistaken assumption?
I love philosophy as metaphysical Cluedo. And it's interesting what you said about sometimes you get to the end of the research and you realise that the question wasn't the right question, so then you have to find the right question. Because in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the supercomputer says, well, you haven't found the ultimate question.
Okay.
So go and find the question, go and find the right question. And so the humans are sent away to go and find the ultimate question. That's quite nice.
Yes, yes. Well, philosophy is quite like that. Sometimes you think, well, these guys, they weren't asking the right question. And now we know a bit more, we can figure out what the right question might be. Yeah.
Nice. So I understand that you're doing some research currently on animals.
Well, the research that I've done already, the research that was sort of the basis of the book that I wrote, Metaphysics for Freedom, that came out in 2012, that was, it's not a book about animals, it's a book about free will, but my sort of angle was, I was looking at the free will problem in philosophy and constantly thinking, this discussion completely ignores animals and shouldn't. I kept thinking, we can't be the only things in the universe that have this capacity that philosophers are interested in to do one thing when they could have done another. That seemed utterly wrong to me. There was this tendency to think, well, maybe humans have that capacity. In some sense or other, it's obvious that they have that capacity, and different philosophers give different accounts of how it's possible for humans to have that capacity. And then everything else, inanimate objects, machines, and by implication animals, all that's just mechanistic, deterministic stuff that we don't have to worry about. And that, putting the divide there just seemed to me bonkers. I thought, well, it seems to me clear that animals have a sort of freedom. They can go, to their food this way or that way. They can have a few more minutes lying down in the sun, or, they can get up and have a bit of a wander around. They can eat that grass or they can eat this grass. That low-level varieties of freedom are available to, at least to many animals. I don't want to say how far it goes down. It clearly doesn't go down absolutely all the way. I think
to rocks.
It certainly doesn't go down to rocks or plants. I would say even very, not to amoeba and not to the simplest of creatures, probably not even to lots of insects. I think that's about the place where I start to feel a bit uneasy and think, it might really mostly be tropism, mechanism,
right? Not
very much choice at all. For the simpler insects, I just have to hold my hand up and say I don't know enough about how impressive insects can be. I did some reading on spiders, and they're pretty fancy, actually. At least some of them are. They do kinds of things.
Tell me.
Well, so one of the things that really amazed me was this thing that I read about a tropical spider, which eats other spiders. And these naturalists had been watching it. And it had been trying. One of its things that it does is it mimics the struggles of a trapped insect on the edge of the other prey spider's web, to try to tempt the prey spider to sort of come out of its web, thinking there's an insect there, and then it grabs it. Okay, that's not the thing that's impressive. Okay, it had been doing this for a bit and not really getting anywhere. And this prey spider is kind of suspended from a rock projection in its web. And after trying and failing for a few times, the predator spider goes away from the web and undertakes this journey that takes about an hour. Okay, it takes about an hour, goes out of sight as well of the prey spider, and eventually reappears on the rock projection. Okay, above it, swings in, grabs it. Okay, now what that says to me is that there's an enormous amount of spatio-temporal awareness, of planning. It can keep track of that plan for an hour. It isn't just responding to an immediate stimulus, as one might think a creature as simple as a spider might do. It's made a plan, it's carried it out in the absence of any perception of the prey. It's gone away, it's done, it's made a route. it's like it. I mean, I know this is a bit of a tententious thing to say, but it's as though it thought to itself,
Yeah.
I'm going to get up on that rock projection there and swing in and grab that spider. I mean, it was a revelation to me in that I had not imagined spiders might be as complex as that. I had imagined that they have, they've got an instinctive program which tells them to build webs. They build webs, they wait there, they eat what comes into the web, and that's pretty much it. But that's a pattern of behaviour that I think is much, much more interesting than I would ever have imagined a spider was capable of. I mean, once something is away from the thing to which it's responding, and there's a time aspect very important, that it hangs on to this plan and follows it for an hour. That's quite a long time. It looks as though it's got to formulate a plan of activity, and as it's moving, towards the rock projection, it's got to keep that purpose in mind in inverted commas, but it's in some way got to cling on to that kind of action plan, and that does seem to involve a kind of formation of intention of the sort that I anyway would never have suspected a spider was capable of. So it is something to do with spatio-temporal kind of indirectness or something that makes it seem impressive. I mean, there are more and less exaggerated ways of saying what the spider does, and you might think, well, you shouldn't be talking about the spider thinking to itself, oh, I'd better get up on that rock projection. Maybe, that probably is a silly way to put it, but still, I think, something pretty impressive is going on there.
Even if it's at the level of, it might be that it starts a biochemical process.
Well, certainly it must be a biochemical process, but the thing I would say, Rita, is it's a biochemical process when we do it. We are biological creatures. It's always a biochemical process.
Exactly.
So, the question is, which types of description are appropriate? Biochemical levels of description are always going to be there for all biological creatures, I think. Biochemical explanations of why they do what they do will be there. And then the hard question is, well, are psychological explanations also available? And if so, which ones? How sophisticated should the psychological explanations be? I think that's a very, very difficult and interesting question. But my inclination is to think that in the 20th century, certainly, I think maybe psychology is entering a new phase now, but definitely in the 20th century, psychology was maybe too cautious about psychological explanations in animals. There was the massive impact of behaviourist psychology, which really held sway, right through from the 20s to probably the 60s, really. Saying that we mustn't attribute mentalistic processes to animals, perhaps not even to ourselves. The most radical behaviourism didn't even countenance our mentality. It really was a very, very crazy view. I think I told you last time we met, I've been working on this principle called Morgan's Canon, which was formulated by a guy called Conway Lloyd Morgan, who's thought to be the founder, really, or one of the founders of comparative psychology. That's to say, psychology which looks at the similarities and differences between ourselves and animals, and amongst different animals. And he had this principle which basically says, if you can explain a pattern of animal activity in terms of what he called lower processes, well, then you shouldn't explain it in terms of higher processes. That's to say, you go for the lowest explanation that will, empirically speaking, do the job. And I think that principle has probably had a pernicious influence in psychology, that it has made psychologists too reluctant to consider imaginative, sometimes intentionalist explanations of animal activity, when in fact, those would be illuminating and perhaps one could even say correct in the case of certain animals. Because, I mean, we come back to this point, you can offer dumb explanations of our behaviour, as it were, this biochemical process, then this biochemical process, then this biochemical process, because it's all biochemical processes at one level.
Yeah.
You can do that for us. I mean, there's that problem of, other minds. In our own case, how do I know that anyone apart from myself is conscious ever?
Yeah.
I think in psychology, the kind of, they take it for granted that somehow magically we do know that other human beings are conscious. They assume that perhaps language is crucial. You can tell me stuff about how you feel, but language is one more bit of behaviour. So I've never really found the idea that you should place the divide very clearly there epistemologically between humans and animals very convincing. It's the same problem for all the creatures with which we come into contact. You don't know of any of them. If you are being epistemologically extremely strict, you don't know of any of them that they're conscious. So I think one has to bring the same principles to bear in both cases. And if intentional explanations look to be illuminating, if they seem to give you a handle on the behaviour that makes that behaviour seem more kind of understandable, then that's at least prima facie evidence for the appropriateness of those intentionalist explanations. Not the last word, there's lots of interesting empirical research to do, but I think Morgan's canon has been a problem.
So that's part of the research that you're doing now?
Arguing against Morgan's canon, really, and saying, we don't need it. And moreover, we shouldn't have it. It's likely to lead us astray.
Have you seen those experiments that people have done, particularly with dolphins and elephants, which apparently have a much bigger brain than we do, where, and I think some primates as well, where they do empirical experiments on how they have self-recognition with mirrors?
I've read about them.
You've read about them, yeah.
I mean, the ones that I've read about are with chimpanzees, which seem to be able to...
Yeah, so what they do is that if they go to the chimpanzee and put a mark on the forehead...
I think it's essential they don't feel it.
They
anaesthetise so that the chimpanzee doesn't feel it. But then, looking in the mirror, they see, I don't know, a red dot or something. And they try and get it off. They're like, what's that? Yeah. But you see, even with experiments like that, there are people trying to undermine them on a sort of Morgan's canon type basis. They say, no, it's probably a side effect of the anaesthetic. Perhaps the chimpanzees, feel their forehead feels funny as sensation comes back or something, and so they're just going, I mean, that's now been empirically absolutely disproven, but it's just an example of that, how there's that prevailing tendency in psychology to come up with what has become called in the literature killjoy explanations, the boring explanations of animal behaviour that are less exciting than the ones we like to immediately, suggest. But as in that particular case, the killjoy explanation is not only more boring, it's very implausible by comparison with...
It's almost like to have Morgan's canon as the explanation for that phenomenon, you have to have a really convoluted way of explaining it.
I think so.
So you're actually undermining, because you have to go around the houses and go, it's the anaesthetics and whatever. I mean, isn't the simplest explanation that they see a dot?
Yes, I think so. And there's also, of course, other cues that you're picking up on when you look at a chimp looking in a mirror. You're seeing what they're looking at. Perhaps you can see that they're looking at the dot, rather than just forehead area in general or whatever. We are very good at understanding mentality in others, and we pick up on all sorts of stuff when watching animals doing things. I think it's, it is sensible to bear in mind alternative possible killjoy explanations and to test for them, as indeed happened in this particular case. Empirical methods are important and one needs to be able to rule out the killjoy explanations. But where you've got kind of empirical parity, where you've got the killjoy explanation together with a more exciting psychological explanation, what Morgan's canon tells you is go for the killjoy one. Now that seems to me bonkers. The right reaction to have when you've got these empirically equivalent explanations, the right response is agnosticism. We don't know. We've got to wait until someone comes up with a clever experiment to distinguish them. Not the killjoy explanation is right. I mean, I think we see animals doing interesting, creative stuff. I mean, even that spider that I told you about before, in a sense that, that's a creative response to a tricky situation, a very impressive response. But you see, you watch animals playing, for example, there's a freedom and a spontaneity in that play. All squirrels are in different environments, there are different trees, you have to utilise that environment in a free way, as for example, to come back to dancing, as you would as a dancer. You're in different spaces, and you have to use your space in different creative ways. And I'm sure the basis for that kind of freedom of movement is in our animal nature.
And I wonder if in addressing questions like consciousness in animals or in human beings, I wonder if there is a place in philosophy that takes account of affect. And what I mean by that is, I know you're not a zombie. Of course you can take me through a process where be taken down an argument where I have to agree through reasons that I don't know. But there's something about affect that tells me I know you're not a zombie. And I often wonder whether that form of knowing has a place in philosophy. Does this make sense?
Yes, very, very much so. Very much so. I mean, actually, that kind of thought is going to be part of the project that I'm about to start working on, which is called Persons as Animals. My thought was, I'd done this stuff with animal agency, and thinking about animal agency had made me think the free will problem needed to be kind of reformulated, really, rethought, set up in terms of, the question which things have agency rather than the question which things have free agency. And that kind of made me think there might be other areas of philosophy of mind where it would be very, very helpful to think a lot about animals, about the fact that we are animals, about the fact that lots of our capacities are embodied and are evolved from, capacities that animals also have. And actually knowledge, as you just suggested, that's one of the things I want to look at. I have this feeling that one of the problems with our approach to epistemological skepticism, I've been thinking more about skepticism about the external world, but your case of other minds would do just as well, in a way, that part of that, the problem and the apparent complete insolubility of the problem stems from a conception of ourselves as not really knowing that we're in the world at all, because the body is forgotten. The body's forgotten. Visual perception is totally privileged, and so we come to think of ourselves as though we're sort of watching a film of the world and wondering, whether it's really there or not. That's not what experience is like. I think we need to rethink epistemology in a way which takes vision away from centre stage and puts embodied forms of perception back at centre stage. So, I know now that I'm sitting down because of feedback that I'm getting from my body. But I know that, through bodily feedback, I can feel the chair I'm sitting. We have intimations of a world which are, I think, much more direct than the ones we have from vision, much more basic, much more important, much more widely spread actually throughout the animal kingdom. I mean, it's very hard to think of an animal that doesn't have perceptual feedback of that bodily sort, so that it knows what it's in contact with, which way up it is, things like that. So my thought is that it will be very helpful to think about those modes of perception some more. Lots of analytic philosophy of perception is totally dominated by vision, and the theories of perception, vision is always the model, and then someone may stick a sentence on the end saying, of course, this applies also to all the other senses. And does it really? And yeah, I mean, there's some very interesting and good work now on audition, which is becoming much more widely looked at. Also smell and taste. But I still feel as though bodily forms of perception are a little bit poor relation in philosophy, that they haven't properly been thoroughly studied. Or if they have, that study's in a bit of a, it's corral, it's in a bit of a, hole of its own. And it's the big potential repercussions for epistemology more generally haven't really come out yet, and so I think there's a lot of work there that needs to be done.
That is fantastic. That is the research that you want to do.
Oh,
that
good.
is
I'm glad you think so.
I mean, as somebody who obviously understands bodily perception, and
of course,
it's my mode of knowing the world.
Yes.
So I think that's absolutely fantastic.
Oh, good.
That you're doing that.
That's...
How amazing. If you ever need a dancer.
You must have, I mean, as a dancer, a much more kind of refined awareness of these sorts of things I'm talking about, where your body is exactly, how your limbs are relating to one another, where you are in the space that's surrounding you exactly. All those things, I think, must be things that you have to refine very considerably as a dancer. Balance, obviously, that's another thing.
Yeah.
Another neglected sense. We are somehow able to stay upright and not fall over. Yeah. How is that?
I mean, the fascinating thing that it never ceases to amaze me as a dancer is the body's ability to learn and then turn that learning physically into the growth of a muscle. So if you do a lot of repetition because you're trying to learn a particular movement, the muscle has to grow and adjust for you to do it. So how matter responds, but also how a lot of embodied knowledge then becomes unconscious. So sometimes I am doing a thing, and for me it's as simple as walking, and when I'm teaching I'm having to deconstruct it because I don't know what it is. I can't separate it.
Yes.
Like most people wouldn't know how do you walk, you wouldn't, but you just do it. And to me, and the role of repetition I think is fascinating, and the way apparently it's 10,000 repetitions are needed for a body to learn a particular high-level skill. And I think that's so fascinating, so different from conceptual learning, because also when you learn as a physical mover, you understand it, but your body takes 10,000 repetitions to match the understanding. So you can know all the theory of it, but your body won't do it. Okay, sidestepping again, but it's still linked to animals and us as animals. Some people would say that the reality of whatever it is out there is obviously species specific, because we have 5 senses or 6 senses, and we perceive what we perceive because we have these modalities of perception that enable us to perceive the world as we do. And for instance, if you're a bat, or a dolphin, you have sonar,
Mm-hmm.
sonar sense. And so if that was looking at us now, they could see through because they can bounce sound off.
Yes.
So their perception of the world is obviously different. And then I think the argument goes, if you follow it, it goes into, so therefore, what we see is just, it tells us less about the world, but more about what our species-specific apparatus for engaging with the world is. Is that something that you have come across or think about, particularly in relationship to
yes,
us as animals? And
yeah, I mean that thought's very, very obviously very present in philosophy in general. That our perceptual contact with the world is mediated via the particular senses that we happen to have, and we could have had others, and other species do have others. I guess most philosophers would be resistant, and I would be resistant to the thought that it follows from that we don't share a world with those other species. That yes, we have a very distinctive mode of access to the world that colours the way the world appears to us, but I'm quite happy to say, nevertheless, I'm in the same world as the slug is and the bat is and the dolphin is, and it's hopeless to spiral off madly from that initial very sensible thought that we have distinctive ways of appreciating the world, to think, oh well, it's there's millions of worlds then, and each species is in a different one, perhaps even each individual is in a different one. That seems to me to be
I see. So when people take that
exaggerated
argument further,
oh yes,
they go into the idea that we all live in separate. So the spider is not in the same world, rather than we just construct it.
Certainly, in the history of philosophy, there have been
Wow.
people prepared to take the case as far as that. But
So when you say different, as in different bubbles, like different.
That's right. You're all in your own little bubble. Yes. Perhaps with, for example, someone like Berkeley thought that the world basically consisted of ideas, and that their order was arranged by God. And so, you're all there in your little bubbles with God, feeding you the ideas. And it's very hard to understand how in Berkeley's world you don't really meet anybody. You have ideas.
You're having an individual
people.
Hallucination.
You are, yes, that's right, effectively, yeah.
But then how come the spider is in my world? So I'm hallucinating a being.
God puts it there. God gives you ideas of the spider. And there will, because God wouldn't deceive you, there will actually be somewhere in the universe a spider having its own maybe having its own ideas. I don't know whether Berkeley thought animals had ideas, maybe not. But yeah, it would be, the spiders are made of ideas for Berkeley.
Oh, I see. So people do take it that far. And
Have done. I think it would be unusual now to be.
So would you say that we're all in the same world? There is something that we all share. There's something, but we construct it differently because of species specificity.
Yeah. I believe in kind of space-time as a reality in which we are all positioned. So that's what makes it right to say we share the world. We are in shared space, we're in shared time, we meet the same objects even though we have different, experiences of them. Even you and I now sitting on opposite sides of the table, you've got different visual impressions from the ones that I've got sitting over here, but of course it's the same table for both of us. And it would be for a slug as well, although the slug wouldn't have the concept of table. Well, who knows? No. The slug will never have the concept of table.
Oh, thank you so much, Helen. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to
welcome.
you.
And it's been a pleasure talking to you as well.
Could have done it for hours and hours and hours. Thank you.